about the meeting first. Most of you are Midnight Sun Bee Club members. Those of you who aren't, I am sad to tell you that this is the last Zoom meeting we're going to let you attend for free. Um, um, but the good news is club membership only costs $20 a year. And so if these information has been helpful to you, then you can join. It's $20 a family. So I guess the people with really big families get a screaming good deal. Um, we plan, even when the COVID restrictions are lifted, we plan on continuing to do Zoom meetings. We're still trying to figure out exactly how we're going to do that. Chris Barnes has been very gracious to be our host. He's a beekeeper in Texas who's going to come up for the summer, and he gets to write off his trip by attending some beekeepers' yards this summer, and by helping us. So look at that; it works out for everybody. Most of you should have gotten an email with an invitation to the email, and there is an application in there that can be mailed in. And Nathan is also going to work on a way for people to pay electronically, so we don't have to worry about snail mail. And although you'll probably, I guess you can complete the document and scan it to Nathan. You can get in touch with him if that's something that you want to do. But for now, please enjoy. We have had a great time getting these Zoom meetings started. And here's the general rules. Because there's still, you have this, it gets a bit crazy when everybody's unmuted, so we'll try to keep you unmuted. Chris is the moderator, so he's going to be able to do that, or the host, I guess I should say. And if you have a question, use chat to get it on there. If you don't know how to use your chat, then just like wave your hands in front of your face frantically, and we'll assume that you either have a question or are having a seizure. We'll figure it out, get you unmuted and figure that out. But we might not get to it right away. We will get to it, and we'll work our way through the agenda. So Thomas asked a question about the link to pay, and we are going to work on that. We don't have one yet. So Nathan, are you ready to address? Well, first, Nathan, did I forget anything, or did anybody have any questions before we get started?
If you don't know how to unmute yourself, just holler and we'll show you how to do it.
If you see your picture and you see that there's a little microphone icon with a red line through it, and if you click on that, or if you just hover over it, it gives you the chance to unmute.
Lay down.
Well, Katie, if you have a question about the process, now would be when you would do it. But otherwise, about the bees, just put it on the chat. Actually, you can put it on the chat at any point. We'll make sure we circle back and get to it. All right, Nathan.
Okay.
It's your show, and you're going to talk about feeding.
Yeah, so I know a lot of this stuff is repetitive, and we've talked about it before, but it's different for, you know, the time of year, not just the time of year, but the conditions outside. I like to do little experiments where I set food out and see if the bees will actually take it. And at least on Saturday, I opened up one of my 5-gallon buckets of sugar water, and you know, normally when I'm filling the feeder jars, I get bees landing in those buckets, and I got to try to scoop them out and all that, but they were completely ignoring it. So you may find that they're completely ignoring the feed at this point. We've got a lot of dandelions, at least where my bees are at. There's a lot of wild rose popping as well. Actually, it would be a great time to trap pollen. That wild rose pollen is fantastic. Kind of a greenish gray. You know, but feeding is complicated as far as when to stop doing it, because it's all dependent on how much they have in the hive as stores. But as a general rule, I would say continue feeding unless when you get in.
Nathan, you there, bud?
Oh, geez, sorry. I was muted that whole time.
No, you said the thing about feeding is when you, and then you got muted.
Oh, okay.
Just in the last 10 seconds. 10 seconds.
Okay. Right. So as a general rule, I would say continue feeding if you're drawing comb. But the best thing to do is to do your hive checks and look to see how much feed is in the combs. If you've got 3 or 4 frames of capped food, you probably would want to stop. There's also a lot of space being taken up by pollen being stored. So it's good to have a constant slow trickle of feed when you're drawing comb especially, but it does get to a point where so much feed is stored that the hive can become honey bound where there's nowhere for the queen to lay eggs. So usually at this time of year, you're still going to be feeding, but this is also about the time of year that they'll just stop taking it, or that you can run into that problem of just having too much feed. So that's basically what I wanted to say about feeding. The other type of feed would just be pollen replacement, and I wouldn't worry about that right now. There's tons of pollen going in. Is there any questions about feeding?
Hey, Nathan, if you when you pull off one of your queens from the two queen hive, you're gonna pull your queens off and make some 6 frame nukes out of those, right?
Right.
Will you feed the nuke?
Probably. I probably will, depending on how much food is in the frames that I put in there, but most likely I will give them at least 1 quart jar of food, of sugar syrup. I'm
Okay.
not going to worry about pollen patties, but definitely I'll give them the sugar syrup and they can take it or not. Looks like Katie has a question. Katie just asked a question. I just got to look it up here. Oh, every bunch of questions. Okay.
Well, you had said, I think you said that you would stop feeding if they had 4 frames of syrup.
Yeah, if you see a lot of syrup, a lot of food that's been stored, I would chill out on the feeding. At least
But
give them a break for a week.
but you got to talk about what size box you're talking, because if you're talking four
Right.
10 frames, that's a lot.
Yeah, yeah. If you got a 10 frame box and you've got 4 frames of capped sugar or honey, you should stop. Or at the very least, put the next box on and let them start filling that up. What does a queen cage use to cage the queen? Al, I would say it. I mean, when I've caged queens like that, I just use, um, a regular queen cage, JZBZ queen cage. How
I
much
think
stored sugars?
I think he's referencing those push-in queen cages that a lot of people use. Maybe. Al, you want to
Right.
unmute yourself and
No, I was actually wondering, I've seen those push in, but I was wondering if you had something else, but I think Nathan has already, I don't know, and Nathan just use a cage just like the one that, the 4 pound package, the same cage there.
Yeah, that's a JZBZ cage, and you can clean it up and remove the wax from the openings in it and reuse it.
Have you got any extras?
I do, yeah. I
Okay.
don't cage them very much. I usually will make splits instead of caging them, or I've got a few people that need queens, so I might just give them to them.
so let's ask Al why he wants to do that so we can make sure we give him the right answer.
So that I don't end up with brood in my honey super.
Well,
I'm
don't you use,
I'm honey bound now and don't have
okay.
any drawn out comb for her to lay in. So I've got a honey super on top of 2 brood boxes now, and that's the only place that she has to lay. So
So
I don't know what the heck I'm doing.
what I would do is just wait until about the 7th, maybe the 10th, somewhere in there of July, and then you go in and find the queen and pull your medium off, or you just make sure she's not in the medium and then put a queen excluder on top of the 2 deeps, put that medium back on. All that brood will hatch out by the end of July, and they'll backfill it with honey.
So don't cage her at all.
I'm not a big fan of caging queens for any long length of time. They die. They tend to make another queen and then ignore them, unless you make a queen bank where you have
No,
I don't know. It's just not my thing.
Well,
Yeah,
so I want to make sure we answer Al's specific situation, because he's saying he's honey bound,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
they're going to want to swarm if they're honey bound, and you're saying don't cage the queen. And so I think so Al, when you say honey bound, does she have literally no frames, no room left? It's all pollen and syrup and capped brood?
Yeah, syrup. I don't know. At this point, I can't tell what's syrup and what's honey.
So
I just consider at this point that everything in the 2 bottom boxes is syrup, and I'm guessing that recently we've had enough nectar and pollen that I'm probably getting honey in the top medium super.
you
know.
don't have a queen excluder in, right? So she can be up there.
No, I do not.
So Nathan,
I figured I got to let her have someplace to lay, and I'm only honey bound in the 2 deep brood boxes.
Mm-hmm.
And then I threw on a medium that's not honey bound. So
it's undrawn though.
I only did that last week. I planned on going in there today, but with the weather the way it is, obviously I didn't, and it doesn't look like it's going to be good tomorrow. But when I go in there and look, what I anticipate seeing is she'll have been laying in there, and they will have been filling it with honey at the same time. So that was the reason I was going to cage that queen in July. But I think I like your answer, Nathan. Don't cage her. Make sure she's down low. If I make sure she's down low, then I what is she going to have to lay in down there?
That's the problem.
Or make a split, or make a split with her. I'm not necessarily saying don't cage her. It's just not something that I do. So I'm probably not the best person to ask about caging the queen. If it was me, I was concerned about that, I would make a split rather than caging her.
Do you have the equipment to make a split,
You're
Al?
opening yourself up to me asking 92 questions about this. How do I do the split? So I'll let you go.
Well,
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the help you've given me.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that though. We're going to get into that, making splits.
And let's address it a little bit more at swarm management, okay?
Yeah, definitely. Let me go back to the list here.
Hey, let's do the agenda and try to squeeze these in as they come up. Is that okay?
Yeah, where were we? Oh, expanding the brood nest. That's actually perfect.
Not yet. Adding more bees is where we're at.
Adding more boxes. Okay.
Adding more boxes, sorry. Bifocals.
So adding more boxes, just to do a quick chat on that. It's, personally, I'm not a big fan of, the idea of starting with, I'm going to use 4 boxes, so I'm going to just start with all of them. So what I do is when I've got at least 80% of one box drawn out with comb, then I'll usually take those last 2 frames that are undrawn, put them towards the center of the box in between frames of cap brood, if I can, and then add that second box. So basically a rule of thumb is when the first box is 80%, or the second box, whatever, is the box they're working on is 80% drawn out or 80% full, that's when you add the next box. So if you've already got drawn out comb, when you're down to just a few frames left that aren't already full of of bees and brood and food and all that, that's the time to add that second or third box. At this point, it's probably the third box.
Do you use the same rule of thumb for adding a super?
I do. Yeah, although there have been times where I've just thrown 2 of them on there if it's just a booming crazy hive. Sometimes I'll just go ahead and put both of them on, but it's probably better to just put those on one at a time up here as well. That way they fill them completely. So any questions about that? I know we've covered that many times, but
Let's talk about they'll if there's questions about adding boxes, we'll see them. So
okay.
so Carly, so this is a good question from Carly about adding a second box and checkerboarding.
Okay, sorry, I was looking at the agenda. Let me go over to
If you
the
watch chat, I'll
chat.
just roll you through the agenda so you only have to
Okay,
be in one
perfect,
spot.
perfect. Okay, I added my second box. Oh, and took a few frames from the bottom and put them on top. Oh my gosh. Okay, so you so so you did like a lot of people call that pyramiding.
Pyramiding,
Just
right?
kidding. Yeah, so that's, I mean, that seems like a pretty effective thing to do. You know, pull a couple frames of brood and move it up to that next box. Um, and I didn't see the question about checkerboarding, but
Well, I
if you,
said checkerboarding, I meant pyramiding. You were right to
oh,
talk
okay,
about it
okay.
that way.
Um, so, you know, the only negative, I guess I could say to that is that when you do that, let's say it's only 80% drawn out. Now you've got it, you know, 40% of it's not drawn out now, but it can still be done. It's usually when I do that, I just pull one frame up, but you know, that's just how I like to do it. What I've found when you, especially up here with our shorter season, when you leave the bottom box 60-70% drawn out and then put the next one on, quite often you'll check on that box later and those same frames are still not drawn out because they've moved up to the next box. So I prefer to at least have them partially drawn out on the last frame or two before I add the next box on. And if I'm going to move anything up, it's just going to be one frame of brood. But you'll have to let me know how that goes. I think it makes a big difference if you've painted your frames with wax, though. They seem to draw them out a lot faster that way.
Hmm. So would you recommend that she, over the next month or so, that she check those frames once in a while and move the undrawn frames towards the middle,
Yeah, or even move them up to,
or up into
even
the middle,
move,
maybe?
yeah, move them up to the second box and put all the drawn ones in the bottom. One,
Yeah.
you know, the idea, of course, by pyramiding is to give them a good reason to be up in that next box, you know. But once they've, once you've established that, you could move the undrawn frames up and all the drawn ones down, and then you'll have a better shot of getting them all drawn out properly. You're welcome.
So it segues perfectly into expanding the brood nest.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is another one we've gone over many times, but it's so important when you're drawing comb, and you know, especially being that we're using these small cell plastic frames, most of us, they are a little more challenging. It does seem to have made a huge difference to paint them, but um, instead of checkerboarding where you put a drawn frame, then an undrawn, then a drawn, then an undrawn, um, drawn being one that already has the honeycomb built on it. When you put a undrawn frame in between two frames that are full of food, um, a lot of the times they simply make those frames on either side of it fatter to fill in that space, and then they might draw that one out partially. Um, Whereas if you put an undrawn frame in between 2 frames of capped brood, they will not expand the size of the capped brood because they'd have to build on top of it, probably killing it. And I've never seen them do that. So by putting it in between 2 frames of capped brood, they have to draw it out correctly. They can't just, make the food frames on either side of it fatter. So that's one way of expanding the brood nest, is to put an undrawn frame in between 2 frames of capped brood. Another way of expanding the brood nest is just taking a frame that's already drawn and putting it in the middle of the capped brood, giving the queen more space to lay those eggs, and also pushing the pollen and the nectar frames a little further out to the side, as they would be set up if it was a larger colony. They would put a bigger brood nest and then have the frames on the outside. But since we're starting small, they'll have maybe 2 frames of brood and then pollen right after that. By putting that undrawn or even drawn comb that's empty in the middle of the brood nest, you're expanding the size of the nest and pushing that food out to the outside where it should be. Let's see if we have any questions about that. Nope. Okay. I think we've said that one a million times, but
I'm curious how often you get into the bottom box to check on stuff like that.
Not much. I try to set it up before I put on the second box, and I usually don't really dig into that second box until swarm season. But my combs are already drawn out. I've got like 12 double queen hives and another 8 or 10 single queen hives. So it's just hard to have time to completely go through hives. And the longer I've been doing this, the less I mess with them, especially as far as digging through them. I'll watch the entrance, and I don't start really looking down in deep into the hive and completely going through it until we start getting into swarm season, and it's time to make splits, or I'm concerned about a hive swarming on me. Not to say you shouldn't do that. That's just my style. More often than not, I'll just lift the top box up, look along the bottom bars, look up in between the combs, and then look down in between the frames, see what I can see. But I really don't go through the hives as often as I used to. But as a new beekeeper, I would go through them often. The more you look at this stuff, the more you'll understand it, the more familiar it become to you.
It's probably more important when you're still drawing comb.
Absolutely.
So we don't have really drawing comb on here, but we are kind of talking about that. Does anybody have any questions about drawing comb? If you do you see Carly's question?
I do, yeah.
You want to?
I think her yahoos are her bees.
I think so.
But
it's in the wrong meeting if it's not.
But so usually they'll do that. Usually that's drone brood. One way you can try to reduce the amount of drone brood that's put on top of your top bars is by putting a couple of frames, a couple of deep. If you're using deeps, you can put a couple of deeps in there that have wax foundation. They probably do it just fine with regular wax foundation, but what I used to do is put a medium foundation in that deep frame, leaving the bottom third or so open, and they would almost always build drone comb there. And that does cut down quite a bit on the amount of drone comb they put on the top bars. Because even though it's just drones, it's still a waste of their resources to build that and then have you destroy it every time, and you got to scrape it out and all that. It's a little inefficient, but it might be some mite control as well. But if you're using mediums, you could just put an empty medium in there. You could put an empty deep frame in there too with no foundation, especially if you already have drawn comb, and 9 times out of 10 they'll draw it out correctly, but it'll be all drone comb. And yeah, that should help with that.
So some people um,
You're
that are
welcome.
working all mediums will, when it comes, um, well, I'm sorry, I'm, I, you have this last, but I would like you to talk about it now because we're talking about drawing comb, drawing
Oh,
comb
in
and feet.
supers.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so, I'll hear the comment quite often that, it's been 2 years and they just won't draw comb in the supers. Um, but one of the things too, before I forget, that I wanted to mention is it's getting more and more popular, and I like to do this as well, to put 9 frames in the supers instead of 10. That way the super frames are nice and fat. They're easier to uncap. Um, it's just a little easier to deal with when it's time to uncap them, especially if you've used your medium frames for brood in the past. That brood comb is real gummy and a lot more difficult to uncap. So by putting 9 frames in there, they build them out wider, making it a lot easier to use your uncapping knife or uncapping fork to get them ready for the extractor. But if you're going to do the 9 frame thing, you got to have those frames drawn out first. I wouldn't just start with 9 undrawn frames. It's just my opinion, but starting with 9 undrawn frames, they tend to build a lot of wonky comb in between the frames rather than on the frames. So, but another thing I wanted to mention too is it's pretty common for people to have their 2 deeps or their 3 mediums or 1 deep, whatever they're using for a brood chamber. And then when it's time to put their mediums on that are undrawn, they'll put a queen excluder on and put those mediums on there. And quite often the bees won't go up there and start drawing comb, or they'll draw very little. My suggestion to you would be to put the medium on there or the honey super on there without a queen excluder, at least until maybe the 7th or the 10th, somewhere around there of July. Give them a chance to draw some comb and for the queen to lay some eggs in the medium. That way, you can go back, push the queen down into the brood chamber, cage her, whatever it is you're going to do with her, but make sure she's out of the supers, and then put your queen excluder on there. Now the bees are going to stay up there and take care of that brood that's been laid in the supers, um, and hopefully continue to draw that comb. But by putting bare foundation in there and a queen excluder, sometimes, they just don't go up there. So, and that also, if you have only one size of frame, that's a great time to go ahead and pull one of your frames out of the brood chamber and put it in what's going to be your honey supers. A frame of brood, capped brood, because it generates its own heat. Put it up there so that the bees will go up there and take care of that brood and then start expanding from there.
So that's kind of what Al is doing with that. He put his super on because they ran out of room down in the double deeps. So the queen will be up there laying, which is a good thing because they'll be drawing that out.
Absolutely. And, it does, people don't like to let the queen lay in the honey supers at all because it makes makes a real tough comb to deal with. But if you later go to a 9 frame setup, they're going to be building on top of that. And that's actually what you're going to be uncapping is nice fresh wax that hasn't had brood in it. Another
Right.
reason to do the 9 frames. So
So,
yeah, that's mainly what I wanted to mention about that.
so part of this, Nathan, is, there are certain advantages to keeping bees in Alaska, but there's some disadvantages as well. And one is the duration of our season, and and it's just shorter. And so, if you're a first-year beekeeper and you're trying to get that drawn out, um, you're what would you say the chances of them getting a box full of supers drawn out and filled with honey their first year
Um, I would say low.
are?
um,
Yes,
you
yes.
know, but things have gotten a little better since when I first started. I know my first year I didn't have any bees drawing out 3 boxes of comb. But it, you know, what you guys have been doing with paint and wax on the frames and stuff like that is certainly sped up that process quite a bit. So it's certainly possible to have a good year and have them draw out 3 boxes. It's just not something I would count on or expect. If they draw out 2 deeps or 3 mediums your first season, you're looking good. They do more than that, you know, that's fantastic, but it's not real common, you know, especially if you start with 0 drawn frames.
I want to quickly address that too. If you may find when you look at some of those bare frames, if you're going through and you find some frames that they haven't drawn out or that they keep drawing that sideways comb on, you may see that they've actually eaten all the wax right down to the plastic. And they are not going to draw on that plastic frame once they've, or at least it's my experience, that they're not going to draw on it once they've chewed all the wax off. And so what I've done is I always save the burr comb, the brace comb. You just have to scrape when you dress the frames or tear apart, melt it down, and 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 make a little wax block, like a little wax bar. And then when you're out there in the yard, um, like before the season starts, you can paint it on there. In the middle of the season, when there's comb on part of it and bees on that comb, you can't really do it. But you can take your little bar of wax and you can rub it right over that undrawn frame, the undrawn plastic that's got the wax off, and put a little coat of wax on there. They'll take right to it and draw it out. It doesn't take much. Just rub it on there with a little bar.
You know, I think they're one of the reasons that they do that over and over again, where they're building that comb in between the frames, is we're giving them all small cell brood comb foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they might just be wanting to make some drone comb. So I would encourage you guys to do at least 1 frame in each box, maybe even 2, that's either open with no foundation or that has some wax foundation in it so they can draw some drone comb. You know, we don't really give them a whole lot of options where that's concerned. I do see your question, Thomas, and I'm gonna get
Let
to
me
that.
do one quick follow-up before you get to that, Nathan,
Or,
and that's that the other thing about that whacked comb is that if you tear it out and put those frames back in the same position, they'll build it back exactly the same way quite often, because they're making it symmetrical. And when they tie 2 frames together like that and you put them back in like that, they have the foundation for that bad comb there already. So if you
right.
flip one of those frames, if you face them towards good comb, then they won't do that again.
And
I don't know
that's
if I
another,
explained that well.
yeah, you got to reposition them. And that's another reason why it's so advantageous to put it in between 2 frames of cat brood, because they can't do that.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, yeah, so Thomas, where did that go? Thomas Kennedy. He says, do any of you put a canvas cover sheet or piece of linoleum in the top? I've seen this on YouTube videos, and these bees on checks always seem to be down below and are on top less. I think what you're saying is on top of your top bars is what I think you mean by that.
As a kind of an inner cover.
Yeah, to keep them from, I imagine they're doing that to keep them from attaching your top bars to your inner cover or attaching them to your lid. I don't do that, but does anybody else do that?
I'm experimenting with it this year. And I've used
Oh,
Reflexit, like Dennis is saying. And I can tell you that I mean, you should experiment with it and look at some guys online. But when I use a Reflexit under the inner cover, it's beautiful to be able to pop the inner cover and then peel the Reflexit off instead of having to pry the inner cover off and pry it off of the frames they've glued to it. So I really like that. There's a couple things about it. If you use an upper entrance, you have to make sure you put a hole in on that right end, on the end of the Reflectix, so that they can get to it. And you have to make sure you have good bee space. But Yeah, I really like it. I'm going to do more of that next year, um, where I'm just using a essentially a double inner cover, one Reflectix, and then one regular inner cover. Just cut a hole for the upper entrance.
And then there's a couple of comments on that. Well, Jenna said she started with drawn comb from a dead out last year as a first season, got a harvest last season. Yeah, what I was saying about probably not getting honey first year, I didn't mean a first year hive. I meant first year beekeeper when you're starting from scratch with no drawn comb.
Hmm.
But once you've got that drawn comb, you know, even if it's just one box of it, it makes all the difference in the world because the queen can start laying a lot of eggs as soon as she's wanting to, and it just gives them a momentum that the hive can grow quickly, and then they've got plenty of workforce to draw out that next box. And yeah, it's definitely a big difference once you've got even a single box of drawn comb. Let's see, Tammy.
Why don't you address the comb questions, like Katie talking about keeping dark comb?
Oh, okay. I never replace frames, but so I might not be the guy to ask about that.
Well,
But
there's
I
a
don't
lot
do
of people that
treatments.
don't.
Yeah, I don't do treatments. So, you know, if the bees stopped using it all of a sudden, and you know, I kept pulling frames out and was like, damn, these old combs are empty. You know, then I would chuck them, but they just keep using them. So, yeah, I don't. I've heard of people using them for 3 or 4 decades. So, yeah, I don't personally worry about that. I could be wrong, of course, but haven't had any problems myself.
Well, Cayman Reynolds is a beekeeper in Tennessee that brags about using, 13, 15-year-old comb. So I think it depends on where you are. If you're in an area with a lot of agricultural, like pesticides and chemicals, and those things do tend to persist in the comb. I think we're lucky that way in that I don't think there's the same amount of commercial pesticide use here.
Absolutely, I think we're unfortunate in the length of our season, but and the length of our winter, but we're very fortunate in how clean everything is. Sorry about the noise up here. You know, as far as pests, but also as far as pesky chemicals being sprayed everywhere. So yeah,
I want to
actually,
hear.
so I sorry,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Well, I was just
Well,
going to say
I
I want to hear a follow up from Chris Barnes on. I never thought about
yeah.
just smashing the comb down and letting him rebuild it.
Oh, I just used my thumb and smashed any back. Sorry,
Yeah, Chris, you want to
I'll read it
elucidate
myself.
on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's just they can chew up the wax and rather than having to regenerate it from their bodies, they don't waste it that way. But it's still sitting there, but it's not comb that they're going to try to um, put back in a wonky shape.
Huh.
That's
That would
cool.
be a lot easier than what I'm doing.
Yeah, and
Hey,
it's real easy. I mean, you can do it when you're sitting there looking at it. You don't have to process it or anything else. You just smash it.
Do you do that when they build up drone comb in an area that you don't like?
Um, well, it's funny because y'all were talking about drone comb and being here in Texas, we like drone comb. Um, I understand y'all cycle out your hives every year, so that's different. But here we go out of our way sometimes to make drone comb just so that when we have our queens available, we do a lot of our own mating of ourselves or queen mating of ourselves. And so you have to have drones available for the queens to mate with.
So I should have been more clear. So first of all, this group overwinters. We don't cycle them out. So
Okay.
we're big
yeah,
Well,
on
careful,
overwintering.
you
careful
still
now.
So
you still requeen with purchased queens though, right? Or you
when we have to,
okay?
yeah,
So y'all are raising your own queens.
through
In a
split.
sense.
Okay. Um, I would keep the queens then. I wouldn't get rid of them.
Right. No, so to be more precise, so when we have to buy a package, we're getting queens from
Right. Yeah. Of
somebody that
course.
does it commercially. but a lot of people here are are doing splits and trying to make increase. And of course, our season's shorter, so we don't have the same success.
Right.
Nathan's what? You're at 70% long term, your average over wintering down?
Yeah, pretty close. It's
Yeah.
probably more like 65, but
Okay.
um,
Especially after a winter like last winter, huh?
yeah, it went down a little bit.
So when I meant about the drone comb, I just meant um, not that drone comb is evil, but that sometimes you get more drone comb than you really want. And so I just
Oh, well,
wondered
yeah. I mean,
if you smashed it down, if they would rebuild it as drone comb or if they would.
um, on the few cases where I pull up a frame and it's all drone comb, occasionally I will pull that up and start opening some of them out and kind of a poor man's mic check.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if I find mites in it, I'll just take the whole frame and stick it in the freezer. And kill that drone and the mites with it. But then I'll generally just put the frame out in the open and let the bees basically open feed on the wax and whatever pollen happens to be on that frame.
Okay.
Now, once they've opened all that up, yeah, I'll reuse that frame. I'll stick it back in a hive somewhere.
Okay. Well, it's curious. I'm definitely gonna try that because that seems like a really a shorter and more straightforward way to deal with that wonky comb.
Oh yeah.
I think you were talking more about comb that's not properly built off the
I was just curious
foundation.
about, sometimes you go through the bother of buying these small frame plastic, these
Right.
little plastic frames, and then you put it in at a time when they're starting to think about expanding, and so they put a whole bunch of drone comb on your small cell frames. You go, no, guys, that's the wrong program. You have
Well,
comb over here that
I
you can
have
make into.
noticed, and that the frame, where the frames are made of plastic, they tend to build a lot more comb connecting the two boxes together
Yeah.
than
Two
if the
frame.
frames were made of wood. Even
I mean,
if I'm using plastic foundation.
are
Mhm.
you saying they connecting the two frames or actually two, like a
Between the
top bar and a
boxes,
bottom
Nathan.
bar
Yeah,
between the
connecting
boxes?
the frame from the top box to the bottom box.
Okay.
Yeah.
You
Um,
know, I think that's because they can't put drone comb where they want to as easily
Mhm.
with the plastic foundation. I mean, that's why I like to put
well, I
some
still use
wax.
plastic foundation everywhere, though.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty much, well, except in honey supers. Occasionally, I'll stick foundationless up there to do cut comb.
Mhm.
Right.
But the brood box is 100% right cell.
Gotcha.
um, and I don't use small cell versus drones comb and stuff like that. It's just straight right cell.
Mm-hmm.
And they never seem to have trouble building drone cells with that.
Right. So yeah, what I've found is I get less drone comb on the top in between the boxes or in between the top bar and the inner cover, top bars and the inner cover, if I put some deep frames with medium foundation or no foundation, so they've got more space to build drone comb. But I mean, they still do it. It just, I don't know. Seems like they don't do it quite as much.
Well, I can definitely see how that would encourage them to put that in a specific spot, which
Mhm.
is kind of useful.
And I'm having good success with a variation of that based on your advice, Nathan, which is I'm putting one wax foundation in each
Right.
box, and they are
Because we're
definitely filling that with drone comb.
because
They're
we're actually using 4 point. Most people, not everybody, but a lot of people in this group, probably 75, 80%, if not more, are using 4.9 millimeter foundation, which kind of has a whole nother challenge, especially with package bees because they're raised on 5.3 millimeter foundation. But anywho,
so let's talk about laying workers.
um, okay, yeah, I'm just checking these things real quick. Um, should remove it out of cleaning. I think what Thomas is saying is he's got a medium that's full of honey or food, whether or not he should remove it. If it was honey, I don't think it's honey, but if you think it's honey, I would pull it and extract it and put it back on. But you could also do that with sugar syrup too.
I have had a couple of situations where I extracted sugar syrup just to give the queen room. Because when she
Yeah,
runs out of room, she is going to want to swarm.
or you just keep adding. But I think it's better to pull them and extract them. It's unless you're trying to encourage them to build more.
I think, oh
but
man, I'm getting Thomas and Al mixed up. I was going to say, if you have 2 deep boxes full of bees, I wouldn't keep. Yeah, have more than half full capped. You may be in the honey capital of Alaska, Thomas.
oh, I see. The deep is. I'm sorry. I just kind of speed read it, but the deep is full of honey. Or well, it's not honey, but yeah, that's just sugar syrup. I mean, you could extract some of it, or you could just put more boxes on and let them keep drawing. There's so many different schools of thought on that. Of course, the best thing is just not to overfeed them to where they get so darn full that you have that problem in the first place, you know. But it would definitely be good to get some either empty frames to draw out or extract some of that sugar syrup, feed it back to them later.
Katie has a question about cleaning comb.
I don't know how to clean comb myself.
That mice got to.
Yeah, I'd probably chuck it. I don't have good luck with bees rebuilding on stuff that mice have torn up and left their little presence on. So I've gotten to the point now where if they've really torn it up, I just chuck it. You know, maybe Chris has an opinion on that, but I don't seem to do well with frames that have had mice chew them up.
Basically, if I have old frames with old comb that is iffy, I'll stick it in the hive and see what the bees do with it. And if they use it, then they're happy. Then they're obviously happy with it. If I put it in and they just ignore it and are using everything around it, then I chuck it.
That's a pretty good technique, which is let the bees tell you what they're going to do with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. I like that a lot.
I think what Thomas is saying is the Italians robbed the Russians. Okay, so that's not a question. I got you.
Yeah.
Seeing one of the other things here about sugar syrup in your box. One of the things that somebody just taught me to do recently was to add just a little bit of food coloring to my sugar syrup.
Oh yeah.
So that I can look in the hive and tell what's the sugar syrup and what's honey that they've collected. So, you know, if I've got sugar syrup all through the brood, then I know I'm feeding too much. But if I've got just regular honey down there, then they're just doing it from the nectar flow.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you, Robin. I would use the drone comb too. And yeah, that's cool, Thomas. You could save it and use it for winter. Jan says she removes the,
I answered
the mice
Al.
comb. Okay.
I got a question, follow up with Chris on the food coloring. Does it ever stain your wax by putting the food coloring in your syrup? Because I've been thinking about doing that, but I didn't know if it would stain my honeycomb.
Some pink wax.
I generally only do it. Oops, okay there. I generally only do it when I first start putting. Well, I don't feed when I put honey supers on, obviously, but I only do it when I've got brood boxes on, so I can tell where the sugar syrup's going. And that can also be a good clue because somebody down below also asked about do bees move nectar from one box to the other. And my experience is no, they don't.
Yeah.
They will eat the nectar from where they backfilled it around the brood, but they won't necessarily just start moving it from one place to the other.
Oops. Sorry, Katie. I didn't mean to, I meant to respond to Al there. But Al, you're a member of the club. You can use the extractor if you want to extract some of that honey or whatever it is.
I'm too lazy to do that and don't have time, and I can come up with 47 other excuses, but
Okay, if
whatever.
anybody wants,
Okay.
wants
You,
the
you know somebody that offers that service.
Steve Victor's. Yeah, I would, but I don't have time either. But I bet you somebody would do it to keep the sugar syrup, or if you paid them a little bit.
Yeah, because they can always feed it back to them in the fall.
Hey,
Oh,
can you, I had a frame that was filled with sugar syrup. All I did was put it outside, like about 20 feet away from my hives, and they robbed it in like a day and a half, and then I just put it back in.
yeah, the only problem is they're putting that stuff right back in the hive, you know, if
Yeah,
for somebody that's honey bound, you know.
but
But that's
it
what
freed
I,
up a lot of room for my queen to lay in that comb. It's that plastic comb that you gave me.
uh-huh.
Yeah, there was no brood in there because they keep like filling it up with sugar syrup. And then so I moved it up and I put in this queen excluder when the brood all emerged. I just put
Uh-huh.
it outside and they cleaned it right up. And then I put it back in the brood chamber, and now it's filled with brood.
That's
So,
cool.
Nathan, can you address laying workers?
Yes, absolutely. You know, I've seen a few people posting some pictures on Facebook, and you know, it's kind of weird. The first, I would say, probably 4 or 5 years I kept bees, I never saw a laying worker, and now I see one in my apiary almost just about every year. I usually have a helper that I'll set up with a hive for helping me, and it seems like it's usually their hive, but sometimes it's mine too, you know, because I have this thing where I won't do hive checks for them. They have to come out and do them with me, and they won't check their hive for a month or more, and then it's, you know, they got a laying worker. But you can usually tell when you have a laying worker by a couple of different things. For one thing, your number of bees will usually decline dramatically through attrition, but also if you have multiple hives, quite often they'll go and join other colonies that are queen right. At least that's my theory. But you'll see multiple eggs per cell. I've heard that happens. I think I've even seen that happen, come to think of it, with newer queens or queens that have been stuck in a queen cage for a while. You'll see multiple eggs in a cell, but they usually, when I've seen that, I'll go back in 3 or 4 days and it's been fixed. You know, I don't know exactly how, but you know, I was just guessing that the workers pulled one of the eggs out of each cell or something. Um, but anyways, you'll see a lot of eggs being laid, 3 or 4 sometimes per cell. That's a sign of a laying worker quite often. You'll also see a real bubbly looking brood. Normally when you see worker brood, you know, healthy female brood, it's a very smooth surface, you know. When you see drone brood, it's a little more bumpy, you know, kind of dome shaped. When you see laying worker, it's really bumpy because it's a worker that thinks she's a queen, or it could be several workers that think they're queens. And they're laying drone eggs in worker comb. So, you know, some people call them bullets, but they stick out further. So you get this really bumpy, funky looking brood. And if it goes on long enough, you'll see drones that are the same size as workers. You know, there's a lot of talk about how people deal with laying workers. Some people don't do anything with them. They're just like, that hive is lost. Keith Malone was trying to save one a couple seasons ago by putting a frame of open brood in the hive every 5 to 7 days. The pheromones that the brood puts out is supposed to start to straighten out the hive, and also they can make a new queen out of that brood. But personally, what I do is I just move the laying worker from one end of my apiary to the other over and over again, and each time I move it, some of those worker bees will come back and join the hive it was next to, or I just take them and shake them off onto the ground and let them go join whatever hive, usually the one next to where they were positioned at. Another tip with laying workers is to pull all the drawn comb out of the hive right away, because it seems to me that the drones being laid in that nice worker comb tears it up a little bit, kind of blows it out, because now you've got big fat drones and worker cells, and then you end up with a bunch of dead brood in those frames. So if I was you and you find a laying worker, I would go ahead and pull the drawn comb out. Any questions on laying workers? I mean, unfortunately, it's almost like, I don't know. It's not a good situation. There's not a lot of ways to fix it. But let me ask Chris too, down there in Texas, how he deals with laying workers. I'm assuming he's going to tell me he just writes them off, but I want to hear what he.
Well, like most people, when I first got started and I had laying worker hives, I did do the add a frame of open brood every 5 days. And for those who don't know, the reason that works, like you said, open brood produces a pheromone that suppresses workers from thinking they're queens and laying eggs. The problem is what you're really doing is you're only suppressing new workers from becoming new laying workers. The ones that are already laying workers are still going to be laying workers. So all you're really doing is just biding your time until those age out and die off, which is why you have to add a frame of open brood for every 5 days for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, depends on how old those laying workers are. And I should point out it's laying workers, plural, because you never have just one. There's usually at least a dozen, if not more than that. In fact, even a hive that looks good, if you look really hard, you will occasionally find that there's a laying worker in good hives too. It's just that the amount of open brood suppressed it enough of them so that it's not a problem. But getting back to what you were asking, these days, yeah, I have enough hives that I kind of look at that laying worker hive and think, oh, look at all these resources I can give to my other good, healthy hives. So I take that hive and shake it out in the middle of the pasture, let the workers go out and beg their way into one of my other hives, and give the frames that are built with built-out comb to hives that could use them.
Yeah, that's basically how I look at it. Unfortunately, it's just kind of a, sorry for your loss type of thing.
Right. Well, it's kind of, if you look at the long-term situation, by the time you give a laying worker hive enough resources that you've rescued it, how much have you weakened all of your other hives by saving that one? Because
yeah, that's how I look at it.
5 frames of brood out at least. So if those other 5 frames of brood had stayed in there, the other hive would be so much stronger.
Okay. All right. I'm going to get to a couple questions here real quick. Thank you, Chris. Okay. So Thomas has a question about Russians getting pollen from Labrador tea flowers. Making mad honey.
Bad honey. I'm thinking it's a typo.
Bad honey.
I don't
Bad
know
honey.
anything about Labrador tea.
Oh, geez. Yeah, if they're gathering it, I wouldn't worry about it. That's how I look at it. But that might be something we'd have to look up. But yeah,
Well,
I don't
I'm
know.
wondering, Thomas, would you unmute yourself and tell us why you would worry that that might be dangerous?
The Labrador tea is a rhododendron. It's a member of the rhododendron family, and there's discussions about it in northern Ontario that enough of it produces a flavonoid that's called Graynax that produces an hallucinatory effect.
Well, let us know how
It is
that
mad
goes.
honey. It's what they have in Turkey or what they have in
Oh,
the Himalaya. But it
Hey,
comes off of just the Labrador tea flowers. So I asked Dale about it, and he didn't know whether or not anybody had just enough of that flavonoid within their honey production to cause the hallucinogenic effects.
well,
well,
it's in the pollen or in the nectar, or do you know?
I think it's in both. It's a little alkaloid that's inside the actual pollen and in the nectar that causes some of it. It can't. It's like some of it. They say they kind of caution you not to produce it. So, but I have not heard of anybody dealing with hallucinogenic honey up here. So I'm just wondering, because what we have is we have 120 acres of a moose preserve that's down below us, and a lot of it is bog, and it's just completely covered with Labrador tea. And the pollen that comes off of that is kind of a gray brown. It looks like almost gravy. And you can tell
gravy.
that pollen, and the Russians are just gathering tons of it. It's not like the lighter pollen colors. So
I got it.
I'm wondering is, should I be concerned about it, or just let it go and see what happens?
So, Thomas, you're kind of describing wild rose as well. It has a very grayish color to it as well. Is it possible that that they're gathering
There's
that you're
not there's
seeing?
some wild rose here, but it's
Okay.
mainly Labrador tea, like a lot of it. Now we do have wild roses here. We have dandelions. We have all kinds of other ones, but this
Mhm.
is it. This is a gravy looking. It's kind of like a dark brown gravy looking.
Oh, okay. I never knew what that was, that brown color. I mean, if you're asking me, like my opinion, well, I wouldn't worry about it, but I've never heard
Okay.
of anybody up here getting hallucinogenic honey. But um,
Sounds like there'd be a market for it.
I know that's what I was gonna say. Is you corner the market. I think you should bring some to the meeting and we'll all test it out.
Thomas, here's my guess. This is a completely uninformed guess that you don't have your honey super on yet. And so the question isn't, is it bad for you? I think the question is it bad for the bees? I did a quick search. I couldn't find
They seem
anything
to
on
be
it.
doing fine with it.
Yeah. And so if you don't have your supers on, then I don't think you have to worry about transference at all. And my guess is if it's flowering now, it's going to be done in the next week or two, and you'll be able to pop a super on there, and you're going to be getting, they'll be collecting different nectar for your super. So I don't think you have to worry about it, but you do
Or
have
we
super
dandelions and stuff
curious.
like that.
Pull a couple of those frames though
Just
before
I
that
don't know.
happens.
Hmm?
I said pull a couple of those frames before that happens.
All right.
I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. But yeah,
Like I said, we just have a lot of it, and it looks like this. Just I think I can share a screen maybe.
If Chris, can you let him share a screen? I think he has to make you a host quickly or something like
I can
that.
see him.
Yeah, but he's going to do a screen share.
Or
Okay.
make co-host. Can you share your screen now?
It looks like it. So this is the flower that we're talking about.
Oh, that's what that is.
Okay.
People sell
And
that
so
tea
it's
around
remember
here too.
Yeah. So
Sorry.
what happens is you have to drink a lot of it to build up the Gravax, but I don't know if the nectar that comes from the flowers could be much more effective on whether it makes that or not. So I guess if we don't put a honey super on and gather it that way, I don't think it'll be an issue. But I was just curious about it because if you look it up, it is a rhododendron plant and it produces the same flavonoid alkaloid hallucinogen that the other ones do.
Yeah, I did some quick research, just super fast, but I think you're okay. But I would research it and just because I'm curious, because yeah, that's an interesting situation. But I did a quick. It didn't look like it was bad for the bees at all. So,
No.
or something, I would
No.
have had something higher in the search results.
Yeah, I don't think it's bad for bees, but I'm just wondering if it does produce the hallucinogenic honey.
We'll have to look into that a little bit. But even if it does, I think the percentage would be so small when you start getting all the fireweed and sweet clover coming in.
Right. It's going to get diluted.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I haven't heard of anybody having that problem so far, but definitely an interesting conundrum.
All right. Well, thank you.
Larry called me a party pooper. See how you are, Larry. So so next is going to be waxing frames and swarm management. I wanted to go back real quickly. There were a couple early questions I want
Yeah.
to make sure we don't miss. And I'll find them real quick.
There was somebody that mentioned having a laying worker to have drones. I think it was Carly.
Yeah, I think we worked that out. I responded to it in the comments, as did
Okay.
Rob and Jordan. So I think that one's answered. Um, Jen asked if it was, sorry, Beth asked if it was better to do a hive check on a day like this or a hot sunny day.
Well, my opinion would be on a hot sunny day. I don't get into the hives when it looks like this unless I absolutely have to.
Yeah, they can get in a really bad mood when you get into them on a day like this. And
Matt
Tammy,
said he would try it if you're worried. Share a jar with your least favorite neighbor and ask for some feedback.
um, also, Tammy asked about pollen collectors. We haven't talked about
Oh,
that, but that'd
yeah.
be a good thing for you to talk
That
about.
was way back there
Yeah, I'm
somewhere.
going way, but I'm making sure we haven't missed anybody. So
Yeah, sorry about that. What was the question though? I saw it and then
just generally address pollen collecting.
okay, so actually if anybody wants to borrow a bottom mount pollen trap, I'll hook you up. I've got 3 of them that I don't use. I only use top mounts now. I don't like having to lift the entire hive to collect pollen. And I think the pollen's a heck of a lot cleaner using a top mounted trap. When you put pollen traps on, I would suggest you put them on and walk away. Don't sit there and watch your hive or it's going to freak you out because it takes them a while to figure out how to get in through the trap, but they will figure it out. The one advantage though to a bottom mount pollen trap is they normally have these tubes that make it a one-way street so that the bees are coming out through these tubes and they can't go in that way. And then they have to go in through a couple layers of mesh that brushes most of the pollen off their legs and down into the drawer. Now, you can remove, once you've trapped pollen for a few days, 3, 4 days, 5 days, whatever, you can pop out a couple of those tubes and you'll still keep collecting pollen because half the bees are going to be habituated to going through the trap portion. So you're still going to be collecting pollen, but it allows pollen to keep coming into the hive. And even if you have a lot of pollen, it seems to me that when you're trapping it and you cut off the supply, I think it might have an effect on the bees and they may stop laying thinking there's some kind of pollen dearth going on. So that's why I only keep them on for 3 to 5 days. And then I make sure that I open up another way for the bees to get into the hive. So at least some of the pollen's coming in and the queen keeps doing her thing with laying eggs. It is a great time to trap pollen with this wild rose. I think wild rose is one of the best pollens we get up here, that and the fireweed. And there's been a ton of it coming in. So, yeah, I mean, and as far as, I guess, what to do with it, most people use it in smoothies. Nothing's as good as the pollen that's fermented in the comb, but still, it's a good commodity. I certainly would buy some of it if anybody's selling it. And if anybody wants to borrow a trap or two, give me a shout. Any questions about trapping pollen other than that?
I think we answered Tammy's question. She said thank you.
You're
So
welcome.
why don't you and it's a great meeting. We're clicking right along, but we have to keep working. So how about waxing frames? You've addressed that a little bit about success, but
Well, I've never done it. So you would probably be the one to talk about that. I've just heard such good feedback from people, and I wanted to hear more feedback and just let people discuss it a little bit and share it with those that haven't heard of it, because it seems to be making a massive difference.
so I use plastic frames for the most part. Um, 9 frames out of every 10 in my box is a plastic frame. And when I first started drawing it out, I had a lot of wonky comb, and I saw a thing on YouTube about painting them with extra wax beforehand. I started doing that when I first started out. I bought wax from Nathan to do it, and it's not that I don't want you to buy wax from Nathan. He makes money on it, but I now save all of the cappings from honey, and I save the burr comb and brace comb that you have to scrape out of the way from the bottoms of the frames and stuff. I save it all summer long. Keep a nut jar or a yogurt container or something handy close to the box and just put it in there. Nathan just wads it into a big ball and sticks it on top of the hive. And that works too, but I'm always knocking it off and then digging for it in the grass. So I find it's a little better if I put it in another container. Also keeps it out of the weather, and it keeps the bugs off of it in case there's a little syrup in it. But anyway, I melt it down, and that gives me enough to put a good coating on the new frames. And like I said, I will melt some down and make a little bar out of it that I can also keep with me. And if I see a bare spot that they've chewed on the frame, I'll put it on there. And to me, the difference is remarkable. I mean, you just never get bad comb once if you paint it with wax good, add extra wax, and and they're in a comb drawing mood. If they're not in the comb drawing mood, they'll eat it off there, and there's nothing you can do about it. So specifically, so there's a couple questions here. Yes, I am talking about the frames come pre-waxed, and I add wax to it. And the best way to do it is get one of those 4-inch paint rollers and melt the wax, dip that in there, and just roll it up and down the frame. It doesn't take a lot, but it just makes a huge difference. If it's in the box and they've got a bare spot on it, like they've just chewed it off of a corner, that's when I just use the bar I've created out of rendered wax, and I'll just rub that bar around it so that I don't do damage to the comb that they have drawn out. But I highly recommend it. I'll tell you what doesn't work is I was just scraping it off the top, that burr comb, and trying to rub that burr comb right on it. They just chewed it right up and did other stuff with it. It's not condensed enough, I would guess. And sometimes it has a little bit of syrup in it or a little bit of pollen, but it's too interesting for them. They eat that stuff right off. So you've got to melt it down and put it on there concentrated. That's the waxing frame spiel.
Keep going. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm gonna have to close out for just a second.
Okay.
I'll be right back.
Nathan's actually trying to work while he does this.
Yeah, I gotta make a call real quick. I'll be right back.
Okay. So sugar water does help them, but they'll eat that sugar water pretty fast. And sometimes, so it depends on when the sugar water gets added to the foundation, because if you add it too soon, then Nathan, I haven't had this happen, but Nathan has had it mold on there, and then they've got to clean off the mold. And by too soon, I mean in April when we're installing our packages. So if you're putting it in there now, that sugar water would get them right on there. So let's talk about swarm management real quickly. actually, let me go. There was one question way back when that I wanted to get back to. I think it was about why would we do a split instead of have a super strong hive. From AKHPC. I'm not sure who that is. But why would you split and make a nuke instead of just making a very large colony? So the challenge for us here, our colonies build up super fast. You want the strongest colony possible. I should say the biggest, the most foragers possible, the biggest bee workforce. Can you let that person in, Chris? Um, um, the biggest workforce possible to collect nectar for your honey, and also to collect other resources, nectar and pollen to raise brood. But if they get too big, if they get too crowded, they're going to swarm. And so one of the surefire ways to prevent swarming is to take the queen out, the original queen, and put her in a small hive called a nuclear nucleus. Usually they're 5, or Nathan has some great poly 6 frames that I really like. And if you take her out with a couple of frames of brood and a couple of frames of resources, she'll lay that up, and your other hive will make a new queen, or they won't. You can always recombine them. But they are not going to swarm once the original queen has been removed. So that's what we were talking about. And oh, Carly also asked that same question. Oh, people are back on another one about waxing. Do you clean or filter the wax? Okay, so here's what I do. I go to the thrift store. I'll get back to that, Chris. I go to the thrift store and buy a pan that I plan on thoroughly ruining, and I buy a strainer that I plan on thoroughly ruining, and and I melt the wax down, and I just pour it through the strainer into another container that has, actually I mix it with water. I put about a ½ inch or an inch of water in it, melt it down good. Don't boil it, it ruins it, but get it good and hot so it's melted thoroughly, stir it good, pour it into a container. The wax floats to the top, the water goes to the bottom, and after it hardens, then almost all of the crud, the bad particles, the bee, the cocoons, or the bits of dirt, bee heads, everything you get in there, that'll be on the bottom. And once you take it out of there, you can just scrape that off. It doesn't have to be super pure to be painting on the frames, but you don't want it super dirty. You want most of the stuff removed, and just melting it with some water in it, ½ inch or an inch, and then pouring it into another container, let it harden and remove it. You'll be able to just put it over your sink once it gets hard and scrape off the impurities. So let's see here. And Chris is saying the wax cappings are pretty clean from the start, which, yeah, I can see that's true. If you put them out and rob the honey out of them, then they should be pretty good to go. So Chris also asked, how big is too big? Depends on, most folks up here run 3 mediums or 2 deeps. So if they look like they're going to get bigger than that, but really when we say too big, that's probably the wrong term. We're really talking more about, are they starting to put eggs in queen cups or larvae in queen cups? That's really what we mean. They have reached the size they have decided is big enough to swarm. And so once they do that, you want to mention anything about that?
Well, I was just wondering if swarming behavior is different up there. Down here, it's either really seasonal, because you can have really small hives try to swarm in March and April. For us, that's spring. But like right now, we're toward the end of our nectar flows. So we have hives that are 2 deeps with 3 supers on it, and they're not going to swarm.
But they've
Not,
got room from this. They've got super room for to spread out their population, right?
they're pretty packed. I mean, when we go to pull the supers off and take them back down to just two deeps, they're going to be pretty packed.
Here's
Um,
what the difference is for us, because swarm season is really they're wired to swarm when the resources are plentiful, right? When
right.
there's lots of pollen and nectar, and our season is much more condensed than yours. So our swarm season really starts in late June and it's over in late July.
Okay. Well, and to that same thing, right about now, the queens actually start backing off because as soon as the nectar flow stops, they're going to quit building population in the hive. So even if the population's big,
Right.
they're not going to swarm because the queen's simply not laying many eggs anymore. So we go through a summer dearth. We have two dearths. We have a summer dearth and a winter dearth, whereas y'all pretty much just have a big winter dearth, if I understand things right.
That's correct. So our honey season starts in late June and it's over by sometime around the first week of August. Last year it was the third week of July because it was so hot and everything dried up. But yeah, it's so condensed that it's all going to happen all at once. In those 4 or 5 weeks is when it's going to happen. So that's why they're just busting. They're getting bigger and bigger, and yeah, the best way to add more space, or the best way is to add more space. And that's what Robin's talking about. She had 3 supers on a hive last year, which is pretty amazing to me. But yeah, once you see them actually putting eggs in swarm cells, or you see larvae in swarm cells, that's when we're talking about making the split. And it kind of wouldn't matter how many boxes you had, because I think you'd agree that once they get set on swarming, it's hard to stop them.
Yeah, once you start seeing queen cells or queen cups with eggs in it, they're going to swarm. You got to do a split to stop that.
And so we're one of the things that we'll tell all of you. You'll see a lot of videos on YouTube where they cut out the queen cells or they tear out the queen cups, and we think that's a terrible idea, because if they do swarm, then now your hive doesn't have a way to replace the queen. So take another solution. If you go out there, you find a queen cell or a queen cup that hasn't, don't tear out the queen cups. They'll just rebuild them. Look in them for eggs or larvae if they're starting to draw them out. Post a picture if you see one online. Post a picture on the Facebook page. You'll get advice. But once they decide they're going to swarm, you're not going to stop them. You have to embrace it. And when we talk about doing splits, essentially what we're doing is we're creating a false swarm. We're removing the queen with some of the workers, which makes the hive thinks it swarm. So the bees that are left are going to try to create a new queen. You still have the original. If you've made the split, you can always recombine them. But in the meantime, if this is happening in late June and through July, that whole workforce is going to be a period of time without raising brood, which means they are bringing in a lot of nectar and turning it into honey for you. You back yet, Nathan?
Yeah. Yep. I'm just
Okay.
listening.
You want to correct anything I said there?
I did have a question. I was curious about with Chris whether they have Italians or not. One thing I've noticed with Italians is they do tend to swarm less than, say, Carniolans especially, and Russians, which are mainly what we use up here, although there's certainly folks using Italians as well. Of course, they all want to swarm at some point.
It's funny because, well, since I do bee removals professionally,
you got all kinds of stuff.
most of mine are what we call mutts.
Right.
So they're a little bit of everything, including Africanized bees.
Right.
Down here, pretty much every hive has Africanized genetics somewhere in it, which is not necessarily all a bad thing. There were some good traits that Africanized bees have. People forget that. But
when you're dying under a pile of bees, it's easy to forget.
Well, and we'll say that tomorrow when I'm doing a removal too. I don't know how these bees are going to act. But now I forgot the original question.
Oh, I was just curious if you
The
use
breed.
Italians. Yeah.
Most people use Italians or some Italian crossbreed down here. What's gotten really popular down here are not so much paying attention to the specific Carnelian versus Italian versus Russian, but looking at the Varroa hygienic
Right.
genetics.
That's cool.
That way we don't necessarily have to use any kind of treatment to cut down on our Varroa issues.
Yeah. So, but adding. Sorry, did you have anything else you wanted to say?
No, that was
Chris?
good.
Okay. So just a couple things to add to, that I wanted to mention about swarming. I tend to see people are a little bit frantic about it, and anytime they see a queen cell or even a queen cup, they immediately cut it out. And one thing to understand is you got time, when you see those. You don't have to, cut it out or they're going to swarm in the next 5 minutes. But there's almost like a phobia, like, oh my gosh, I don't want the hive to swarm. One of the things that my mentor used to tell me is a hive that's wanting to swarm is a successful hive. That's what they want to do. They're programmed to gather enough honey for winter and to procreate, which is swarming. So I never cut out queen cells, no matter what time of year it is, and I would encourage other people not to do it right away. At the very least, verify that you still have a queen in the hive before you start cutting out any queen cells. Queen cup is just is like an empty cell,
Yeah.
It's just an empty cell that's made for a queen. So I never worry about those, but rather than, I did used to fight with them and try to cut the queen cells out, and they usually would swarm on me anyways. So what I do now is if they start making queen cells, I just split the hive. I just take a couple frames of cat brood, a frame of food, and the queen, and put it in a nuke and make a new colony out of it, rather than having to go back there every 5 to 7 days and trying to make sure I cut out every queen cell.
Right.
But yeah, and just to let folks know too, like when people are saying add more room doesn't mean that you can put a box with empty frames on it that have no comb on them. That's not room. More room is drawn comb. So, it's space for the queen to lay eggs, because that's one of the things that stimulates them to start the process of swarming, is they start running out of room. But it's also just what they want to do naturally. They want that, more bees just means a bigger hive. It doesn't mean a larger population of honeybees in the world. So they all want to swarm. So rather than fearing it, sorry, hold on just a second. Come here. Work with it and use it to make yourself some more bees. Split the hive. You can always recombine it, like Tim said. We're probably a couple weeks away from the first swarms, would be my guess.
Mm-hmm.
But you do want to start planning for that and watching for it. But when you do start finding those cells, don't cut them out right away. Make yourself a plan on what you're going to do, because they're just going to keep making them. Or, I've also seen people cut those cells out when they don't have a queen, and it was actually an emergency situation, or the hive had already swarmed, so. And the first sign is that the first real significant sign that I see is a lot of drones being made. Even though those drones aren't going to mate with that queen, that is what they tend to do, is make a lot of drones. The hive is usually very full, or at least a very large population with plenty of resources. So it's really a successful hive. It's not necessarily a bad thing.
So that's why I said that if you see a queen cup that has larvae in it, or you see them drawing it out, take a picture, post it on the page, get some advice.
I think the only thing I was going to add to that is no matter how much you try, I always have at least one or two of my hives swarm every year. So I put up swarm traps around my own hives so that if they do swarm, at least I can catch my own swarms.
Yeah, I caught one of my own
caught your
last
own
year.
swarms.
Yeah, in fact, and the nice thing is once the swarm moves into a trap, and I get those bees out, it's almost a guarantee that if anybody else swarms, they'll go back to that same spot. Because that swarm left all their pheromone behind, and it'll attract
Right.
all the other swarms.
Nice.
I'm sure you found more than one swarm before clustered together, right?
Oh, yeah. I found as many as 5 queens in one swarm.
Oh, wow. I was going to say 2, but you kind of stole my thunder there.
Well, it was massive. It's obviously a whole bunch of swarms all just came together in one spot. It was kind of fun, but it took me a long time to dig through them and find all the queens. And I'm not sure I actually found all of them. I found 5.
So Thomas Kennedy asked, what general date is the point of no return for doing a hive split?
Boy, I personally try to do them by the first week of July, but you know, you want to have enough time for that original hive to make a new queen. Well, I guess it depends on whether you're purchasing a queen or not as well. You know, if you want them to make their own queen, I would say no later than the first week of July. And I think that's probably pushing it a tad bit, but you should still have enough time. I like to do it within the next 2 weeks. That to me, the 21st of June, 25th of June is like, I think you should do it by then, because then the new hive has enough time to build up and the old hive has enough time to recover.
So again, it depends on why you're doing the split, right? Because if they're drawing queen cells, you might be doing the split just to keep your bees from swarming, in which case they might not be able to build up. Your plan might be to recombine all along, but you'd be...
And in that case, you can also just pull the queen and find her a new home.
In which case?
Oh, if it's late in the season and they're trying to swarm, you can always just, instead of splitting the hive, there is the option of just removing the queen, allowing them to make that new queen.
Oh, right. You think they'll, because they can make a queen later in the year if they're an established hive, is what you're saying.
Right. Yeah, you're not taking, you know, 2 frames of capped brood on some hives, that's a lot of it, you know.
It can be
a lot of bees.
So if you find yourself in that situation, like I said, you can ask that question online and get a number of contradictory yet helpful comments and figure out your best path and go forward.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to do it. There's a lot of right ways to do it.
So let's see here. You actually, I think we've made it through the agenda.
Whew.
Amazingly, I didn't think we were going to do it. So if there's anybody who asked a question that we didn't get to, would you, Katie asked a question, which is when you're doing a split, do you leave all of the queen cells? You didn't mean cups, because you mean cells. A cup is essentially a queen cell that's not drawn out and doesn't have an egg in it. You know, once it has a cup, or once it has an egg in it, then you're going to notice it when it's drawn out. So
I think that's officially a queen cell once it has an egg in it. At least that's the way I look at it.
So do you leave all of them?
Me personally, yes. You know, Dee Lusby talked about cutting them out that were capped after a certain day. I figure the bees know better than I do, so yeah, I just leave them all.
Okay, even if some of them look puny?
Yep. Sometimes they look puny because they're buried in the comb. You know, when you're pulling the queen to make a split, it's different than finding queen cells. I think you're better off, in one way, you're better off waiting for them to actually make queen cells in their own time. However, we have a short season. So what we're doing is we're promoting an emergency. We're stimulating an emergency response by removing the queen. So they're going to build a bunch of cells over eggs that are already in the comb. So a big portion of the cell is going to be inside the comb rather than hanging off like like we see them quite a bit, where they're actually making a queen cup and the queen goes and lays eggs in it. So they may appear small, but quite often they're just buried in the wax. But the bees know, you know what I mean? And go ahead.
I was just going to say there's some research that shows that bees they build a bunch of cups, but before they cap them, they'll actually tear some out if they don't like how it's developing or for whatever reason. But they're doing they are managing the situation to some extent too, because it's in their best interest to have a good queen
Have a
hatch.
good queen.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing too is, you know, we don't have to pick that queen for them. I have found as many as 3 queens laying in the same hive. I think that what happens is multiple queens hatch out. I've watched a fertile queen that's come back to the hive and also a virgin queen crawling all over the other queen cells that are still capped and doing nothing to them. You know, maybe they do destroy queen cells. I've never seen it. I think the workers probably destroy them. But I think what actually happens is multiple queens go out and mate. They come back. And I think that the workers just pick the best ones out of that. You know, I could be wrong, but in my experience, that's what I've seen is multiple queens coming back fertilized.
Nathan's dogs.
Sorry.
So I saw some really cool stuff about a guy who used to tear out all but a few queen cells, and he stopped doing that based on some research that I wish I could find. I can never really find this stuff again. But essentially that exact thing, that the bees are doing some culling of their own throughout the process, sometimes even after they're capped. And so the more you leave, the more likely you are to end up with the best queen of the bunch. So, kind of regardless of how the cell looks.
Yeah. What's that saying? Bees make better beekeepers than beekeepers make bees, or something like that. You know, longer I do this, and it's not been a decade, really not that long, but the longer I do this, the more hands off I am, and I just kind of find myself just observing and trying to get in where I fit in, and you know, disturb them as little as possible and mess with them as little as possible, but still get what I want out of it, you know?
Yeah. So if again, there's a few questions coming in, and we're kind of at the free-for-all point for the next
You
few minutes.
know, one thing that I would like
Nathan,
to
something's weird with your audio. Did you change something?
do this year, we could my car things.
Yeah, you're really breaking up. I
Oh,
can't hear you.
sorry, am I back? I just switched from my
Yep. Yep.
Wi-Fi to roaming here. Oh, wow. But anyways, yeah, I thought maybe we could do, you know, we're going to do some queens. I'll probably just do it with one of my own hives, but I still have yet to try to take one big hive and make like 3 or 4 nukes out of it. You know, pull the queen, let them make a bunch of cells, and then divide those up and see how many good queens we can get out of one hive in a situation like that.
I want to talk to you about that later because I believe that's one of the things we ought to do with with at least one of the club hives. Since we're not really going to have honey, there's no way to really sell honey efficiently that I can think of with a club hive. We could sure use it to make bees.
I have found it's hard to sell honey to beekeepers.
All right. So, Chris, maybe, you know, let's see what happens with the restrictions and with everybody's schedule. Up here, it was a pretty short season for beekeepers as well. You know, we got to
Oh yeah.
all us rugged Alaskans are out harvesting fish and berries and you know, drinking, micro brews and stuff we
Making
do.
mad hallucinogenic honey.
Yeah, hallucinogenic honey.
Sounds like
So
something I should help with.
yeah,
Yeah.
so we'll find out. We were hoping to get together. We actually have a couple of club hives this year. We were hoping to get together and do some beekeeping for a meeting, and of course, all this stuff really rained on that.
Oh, yeah.
So we're just kind of doing a wait and see. And just actually for everybody here, we certainly are going to do a Zoom meeting for the July meeting as well. If the restrictions get lifted, we may do a combo Zoom meeting, face to face or something. But there's a lot of people who attend these meetings that are not able to drive out to Anchorage. Out to the valley from north in Talkeetna. I think Carly's in Talkeetna, or me, I'm in Anchorage, a number of other people in Anchorage. But it is a long ways to go, and especially in the wintertime. So we're going to keep doing the Zoom meetings one way or the other, even if we also have some of us face to face and some of us participating by Zoom. So the response has been really good on that. So.
And at the very least, I'm going to get into those club hives and start adding some more space to them. They're still just in the one deep. They were started about 6 weeks ago now. So I'll take a video of that and post it up on the club page. No pressure. Hopefully they're doing good, or I might have to rob some stuff from my other hives.
Yeah.
Make it look good, but if nothing else, maybe we could do the meeting there with a few people, and it'll be the time to make a move with those hives if we are going to make splits or make queens by the next, before, actually we'll have to do that before the next meeting. So
Yes. I have this idea that I'm going to modify a box into like a thirds. That maybe what we can do is just do some splits with a couple of frames of bees 3 ways and see which ones can make a bee. We had high hopes of grafting, but I'm not sure we're going to get to that, and I'm not sure those hives are built up enough to support it.
Right, and we would have to draw we're going to have to draw a little bit of comb for them as well. I put drawn frames in to start, but
yeah, that's going to be a multi-year project, I think. But I will successfully graft. And club members will have queen cells that they can use for splits. It's going to happen.
Yeah, if we could get those hives through the winter and then make some queens off it a second year too, have some overwinter genetics to share with the club.
That'd be better. Yeah. All right, fire off. This is your last chance, everybody. If you've got questions, get them out there. Beth just actually sent me an email. Beth, did you get the email invite from me? This is actually to everybody. If you got an email invite from me, then the membership forms were attached. There's 2 forms. You only have to fill out one. One's for Mac and one's for PC. So don't think there's 2 forms you have to fill out. And questions aren't difficult. And the address to email it or to mail it in is in the email I sent. If you didn't get that email from me, then let me know. Well, first check your junk mail. And if you don't find it, your junk folder on your email, if you don't find it there, then message me and I'll make sure you get it. Tom Kennedy, did you send me that because? Oh, because you didn't get one. Okay. Okay.
By the way, I did just get an email from the experimental farm, and I'll post what they say about the use of the building going forward here.
Oh yeah. So what happened, Chris, is we lost, or everybody that has never actually been to one of our physical meetings, we lost our site because they closed down. So
Oh, yeah.
I do believe they're going to be reopened at least partially for the next meeting. They may already be reopened. I literally just got the notification just now.
My club here in Texas is going through the same thing. We were meeting at a church, which is pretty much shut down completely because their population is almost all older people, and they're concerned about their membership getting affected, exposed.
Makes sense.
So, but we are still, our club is actually putting on a bee school in September, and we have gotten the go ahead and still start doing it. So hopefully that's going to happen. Last year we pulled in about 450 people.
Ooh.
So,
wow.
And guess who's the chairman for that?
Guy named Chris.
Yeah.
this is really just our second year, right, Nathan? Our second full year?
I think it's our third.
Or third full year?
Well, second is the Midnight Sun.
Yeah, that's
Bee
what I'm
Club.
saying. And so we actually have grown quite a bit. And these Zoom meetings, you know, I'm sending out over 100 invitations, and we're having around, we had over 30 people at our last meeting, which is pretty good for us because, you know, I think we had 3 people at our November meeting. It's always bad in the summertime, though. The typical physical meeting was 10 or 12 there for a while in the fall. So no, we have a lot more people, so we'll need a big space.
Yeah, we're definitely going to have to find another location moving forward.
Hey, if you guys don't mind, hey, Matt, I want to say thanks, a shout out to Chris for hosting the meeting tonight, and I think everything went great. I hope that we can do some face-to-face stuff, and obviously some of us get to go to the experimental farm. Somebody's got to maintain the hive, so at least you know, a couple of us can show up, take some pictures, and share what's going on with the group hives, and we'll move forward with what's going on next. But I think Zoom and face-to-face when we're allowed to is the way to go, and thank you everybody for making it happen tonight.
Yep, and thanks, Matt, for you doing that last time, and a super big shout out to Chris Barnes, who is not a member and lives in Texas, but really helped us out. So I just appreciate it a lot. Thanks so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
No butter.
Okay, there's one last question from Katie. Nathan, are you where you can read this?
Let's see.
If you're not, I'll do it.
The hives in 2 deep boxes. I would let it go a little bit longer, but you could make a split now. It's so hard without looking at it myself.
You just
I would give it a couple more weeks though.
just monitor it. Yeah. If you see eggs in the queen cups, you know it's time.
I would give it a little more time just because you can.
Well, all I meant was next week.
Oh.
Yeah. Next week when she checks, just look for it.
Gotcha.
All right. Well, thanks. I think we're going to call the meeting. Again, thanks everybody for attending. I will send out all the invitations again in a